Thank you, Michaela, for that kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for spending the time in this really important and I hope interesting conversation. It still baffles my mind what we've been through collectively over the last 18 months and what we can learn from it. I'm hoping I can share some thoughts with you today on what we can learn from the COVID crisis and what it can mean for some really important challenges for the country around inclusion, around reconciliation, and around sustainability. Agriculture is central to those, and those issues are central to agriculture. Let me start, though, first explaining a bit of why I'm here and why RBC is so excited to be part of these conversations and honored to be part of these conversations. We take our role in Canadian society very seriously. We know we're privileged to have the relationships that we do with clients and communities across the country. Our purpose at RBC is to help clients and communities thrive. We genuinely believe that we're here as a constructive actor in society and lucky to work with lots of great Canadians in every corner of the country. As part of that big mission and purpose at RBC, I have a privileged role in helping conversations like this through research, through discussions like this, through the sharing of ideas constructively with Canadians at all levels and in all parts of the country. I lead a group called RBC Economics and Thought Leadership, and our purpose is to develop and inform ideas that drive prosperity in the full meaning of that word prosperity. And I want to share a few of those ideas with you today and get into a good conversation because we're learning every day on what drives prosperity and inclusive prosperity in our country. So this opportunity is as much a chance for me to learn as to share these ideas with you. We've been researching new themes around agriculture for a number of years at RBC. In fact, we've been involved in agriculture for generations at RBC. But we're into a new era of agriculture, and that's what I want to talk to you today. A few years ago, we published a report called Farmer 4.0. If you want to access it, just Google RBC and Farmer 4.0. And I hope you'll find it a really challenging but exciting and inspiring piece on how advanced technologies are transforming farming and food production across the country, but around the world, and can be really positive forces for inclusion and sustainability if we get it right. If we don't get it right, it can lead to a lot of negative outcomes as well. And that's what we wanted our report to do. So I'll share some thoughts from Farmer 4.0 with you today. But we also did another research piece that came out much more recently, which I hope you also have a chance to look at, called Building Bandwidth. Again, just Google RBC Thought Leadership and Building Bandwidth, and you'll get a copy of that. And that looks at the skills revolution that we're all in the midst of from an Indigenous point of view. We've, over the last year and a half, 2 years, predating COVID, so it's been well over a year and a half, have been talking with Indigenous communities, with Indigenous youth around the country. We've got a good research team, including an Indigenous research lead here at RBC, who developed this project to ask questions around how Indigenous youth can use the profound technologies, including those technologies that are allowing this kind of conversation, to transform their own prosperity, including through agriculture. So I'll draw on both of these research pieces to share some ideas with you and try to put it into the context of COVID, which we're not out of yet, but what we can learn from the pandemic to really accelerate that drive to prosperity in the years ahead. We are really at a profound moment in history, and it's profound for a few reasons. Number one is technology. We are seeing advanced technologies, algorithms, smart machines, drones, robots, cloud computing, doing things that humans have done for eons. And doing them rather effectively. Debatable whether they're better than humans or not, but doing it quite effectively. And I think most of us see this in our daily lives. We hold it in the palm of our hand, maybe a bit too much, but certainly in all that we're doing at home and at work and at play. So we know, each of us, how technology is transforming our lives. And we're trying to inspire a conversation in Canada about how these smart technologies can transform businesses, communities, and all sorts of activities that we want to pursue in our Canadian lives, and be used as a force for good. But we've got to understand these technologies if we're to enable them as forces for good. We also have to understand that technology on its own actually is kind of useless. Technology needs humans as well as humans need technology. And that's a really important point for Canadians to take advantage of. We've got lots to come to grips with as a country, but we can also be really good as humans. And how can we take that good side that we all see in each other and connect that with the powers, the positive powers of technology? That's what we call the fourth industrial revolution. We've been pushing an idea at RBC called Humans Wanted. We've done a lot of research on what skills are going to be needed in this age of machines, in this age of advanced technologies. And we do a lot of data mining on this. We study job postings. We look at the labor market on an ongoing basis. And we find more and more that the skills and demand that we're seeing in all sectors, of course, there are technical skills like coding, but more and more there's a demand for human skills, for communication, collaboration, critical thinking, creativity are growing in demand right across the economy. And we need those human skills. That's why we say humans wanted to work with the technical skills. And how do we find ways for us as humans to be more human and more effective as human, and let the machines be more effective as machines? And if we can combine them, we can do really powerful things as communities, through partnerships, and as individuals. The more we've done this research, the more we've seen the opportunity in lots of sectors, but agriculture particularly. Agriculture, a lot of people think of it as farming, as they've known farming in a cliched way through media for a long time. Farming is one of the most tech-forward sectors that we deal with and I deal with on a running basis. Farmers are techies. I've spent a good amount of time on Canadian farms across the country over the last number of years, and really have come to that realization that farmers are techies. How do we inspire a new generation to see farming as a tech-forward sector that they can apply their lives and that they can invest their careers in, even without leaving home? A lot of the best farm technologists in the world today are doing that from downtown Toronto, or from indoor farms in different parts of the country, or working with farmers of different backgrounds in all parts of the country. I really came to realize this a couple of years ago when I was in Saskatoon, one of my favorite parts of the country, and got to spend time on farms around Saskatoon, looking at the application of autonomous tractors or farm vehicles as they kind of drove up and down the fields without any humans involved, but spent time with the humans who were coding and directing these machines and drawing data from them to try to be more effective farmers. It's just a small example of what Farmer 4.0 looks like. One of the conversations we're trying to advance in the country and inform as best we can is, how do we take this concept of Farmer 4.0 and apply it to an Indigenous context? And how do we take indigeneity and apply it to Farmer 4.0 to develop agriculture, to develop food production with a much more deliberately Indigenous approach and Indigenous ownership? This is the conversation we want to as I say, inform and be part of, if we can, at RBC, because that is critical to reconciliation. Food production is something that Indigenous peoples have tremendous knowledge. I'm stating the obvious of that we as Canadians need to take much more advantage of. We need to use these technologies with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous capacity to develop food production and food systems and agriculture systems in all sorts of new and more sustainable ways. Why? We have to play a role not just in feeding ourselves and feeding the country, but in feeding the planet. Canada on its own is not going to feed the planet, but we have 8 billion going on 9 billion people who will need food in the next 25 years. And we cannot produce food in the way that we have for the last 25 centuries or 25 decades even, in sustainable ways that is going to allow the planet to thrive. We have to develop and advance new ways of food production. We can do that with new technologies. We have to do it with new technologies. But we can also do it with traditional thinking, with traditional knowledge, and with indigenous leaders, indigenous innovators, and indigenous communities at the forefront. This is a Canadian opportunity, central to reconciliation, but also central to our role in the planet. How can we inspire planet Earth, other countries, other food developers and farmers to develop food production systems in more sustainable and innovative ways that allow us all to feed ourselves and feed this planet of 9 billion people in ways that don't destroy the planet along the way? None of us want that. That was the mission behind Farmer 4.0. But connecting that with this idea of building bandwidth is really about putting Indigenous peoples at the and Indigenous knowledge at the forefront. What have we learned from COVID over the last 18 months? It's been scarring, it's been brutal, it's been challenging to each of us in so many ways, and quite remarkable that we've been able to come through it in many good ways together. Let's not lose sight of that. But as we come out of COVID, which we will, may not be soon enough, but we'll come out of this, what should we remember? Well, number one is that COVID united us in some ways. It's divided us in many other ways, but it's united us. Why did it unite us? And how do we stay more united as we develop these ideas for the 2020s? Well, we've come to see challenges as common challenges. And we've come to see opportunities as common opportunities. We've worked together. We've pooled resources. We've put our own personal needs, maybe not enough, but in lots of ways behind us, and worked collectively. Indigenous communities have been doing this for generations. We need to realize that as a country. That's part of reconciliation. But we need to appreciate and invest in it going forward, because that's something else we've learned from COVID. We have suffered, all of us as a society and as communities, from not being inclusive enough, from not listening to diverse voices enough, from not giving enough different people seats, meaningful seats at every table that we have. Maybe we're doing that a bit more today than at the beginning of COVID. I hope we are. But let's do it more as we go into 2022 and beyond. We can do that with these ideas around agriculture 4.0. We can bring together different people to use agriculture, sustainable agriculture, to borrow the cliche, as a team sport. And we can ensure that Indigenous leaders and innovators are very much part of that team and even leading our teams. That's got to be one of the dividends of COVID. And that's what our other research piece, Building Bandwidth, is all about. It's building bandwidth literally, and I'll talk a bit about bandwidth, but it's building our collective bandwidth as a society to allow us to work together. Among the mega trends that we see at RBC are not just this advancement of technology. We're seeing demographic shifts that are really powerful and important. We're seeing great retirement waves across the country. We're an aging society, but we're also a young society. And when we look at the youth of our society, we are seeing more and more Indigenous thinking, Indigenous leaders, and Indigenous opportunities. That's such an important point for Canada. Biggest demographic force in the country right now is Indigenous youth. 750,000 Indigenous Canadians coming into the labor force in this decade with an enormous opportunity to use these technologies of algorithms and robots and drones wherever they may be, in the far north, on reserve, off reserve, using these technologies not to be beholden to the technology, but using them for sustainable and inclusive development and progress. We've got to ensure that these two forces of technology and demographics intersect in a very positive place. To do that, it's not going to happen on its own. We have to invest in a number of things. But I'd like to cite 4 C's, and I'll cite them and leave you with those 4 C's before turning it over to questions, if we are truly going to build bandwidth. First C is confidence. When we spoke to Indigenous youth across the country, I was able to travel the country before COVID and sit down with a lot of really inspiring Indigenous youth, including in Saskatchewan. One of the things I came across was a challenge of confidence. And as we held these conversations virtually through COVID with Indigenous youth, but also Indigenous leaders, we heard that over and over again, confidence. A lot of Indigenous youth have all the skills, have all the talent and the ambition, but sometimes they're just lacking a bit of confidence. And that's on all of us to share success stories, to encourage people, to network, to mentor, and to support Indigenous youth as they are taking bold steps to ensure that they have the confidence when they got knocked down or when they fall down to get up and keep at it. So let's invest collectively in confidence. Second C is curriculum. We have to revisit the curricula of the country from K to PhD from different perspectives, but primarily from an Indigenous perspective. How do we ensure that Indigenous thinking is at the center of curricula right through our education system for all of us? But also, how do we ensure that curricula for Indigenous learners, for Indigenous students of all ages, is tech forward, is both harnessing traditional knowledge systems, but also harnessing technology to allow the next generation of Indigenous innovators to take us all to better places. They can do that with the right confidence and curricula, but they're also going to need connectivity. So how do we invest in connectivity, both physical and psychological, if I can put it that way? We as a country need to spend lots more on building bandwidth, literally ensuring that every Canadian has access to reliable, high-speed internet and is able to do what they do in any corner of the country. We will all be better for that. But it involves a lot more than dumping a bunch of hardware on individuals and communities. We have to invest in the capacity of communities to take advantage of that bandwidth, and that means investing in the softer bandwidth, the bandwidth that you don't see, of virtual networks, of connecting people with people right across the country. So a really important hard and soft challenge there for the country. And the last C that we have to invest in is creativity. We live in an age of creativity. In fact, I think we're at the dawn of a new creative era. We see this in every corner that we can all think of turning through our days. We see it on social media. We see it on mass media. We see it on our streets and communities. But we see it in business as well. We need more and more creative people to solve the epic challenges of our time. That's been a lesson of COVID. We're not going to solve these challenges using old ways. We need creative new ways and a creative new generation to solve our public health crisis. We need a creative new generation to solve our climate crisis. We need a creative new generation to solve the crisis of inclusion and income inequality in our country and around the world. So let creativity blossom wherever it is, but we have to nourish creativity in our youth. We have to be open to it. Creativity can be challenging to us. It can be discomforting, but it can be liberating. So let's seize this creative age and ensure that Indigenous Canadians are very much leaders of this new creative age. And everywhere I've been in the country, I've been lucky to meet people who are eager to get at it. And I'm so keen to come out of COVID and do everything we can to help this new generation, not worry about surviving, but focus on thriving in the decades ahead. Michaela, let me leave my comments at that and open it up to questions. But again, on behalf of RBC, let me thank you and your amazing team for facilitating this really important and inspiring conversation. And I look forward to it continuing. Well, as they say, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. Second best time is today. So let's plant trees wherever we can, because we should have planted a lot more trees literally, but metaphorically as well, 20 years ago and long before that. So what kind of trees can we plant? Well, best tree you can plant is in education. How do we invest in the education of all of our youth, but Indigenous youth particularly? Over the last couple of decades, I've spent a lot of time in Indigenous communities right across the country, from coast to coast to coast. And one of the really deep challenges is education. There have been incredible improvements over the last 20 years. In fact, we see this in high school graduation rates. They've improved significantly for Indigenous youth over the last 25 years. That's a great outcome, lots more to do, but we've really fallen short in post-secondary education. We're not seeing enough Indigenous youth in their 20s and 30s with post-secondary educations. So how do we invest more at that level of education? And it's not about doing things the way we have in the past. We have to create new models of post-secondary education from an Indigenous perspective and for Indigenous youth, wherever they may be. We've got the tools to do this. There's no reason we can't do this. But how do we seize on all the technologies that we've come to know and love and sometimes curse through COVID to allow Indigenous youth to learn and to share their knowledge and learning wherever they may be? So invest in education. Secondly, invest in bandwidth, but as I said in my comments, not just in the physical bandwidth, there's lots to do there, but in the softer side of bandwidth, to ensure that there are people in communities who have the skills and the aptitude and the passion to take advantage of that bandwidth for whatever the community is doing and inspiring to do. So planting those trees in the form of people, in the form of education, and then the capacity outside of education to apply knowledge with and through technology. We need to learn from a lot of the progress that we've seen in the country. We know of, we don't know enough, but we've come to realize this summer, particularly, of all the faults and mistakes that we have made, and we have to continue to understand those and why those happen, and frankly why they're continuing to happen. But let's not overlook or shortchange much of the success that we've had over many decades, including and especially from Indigenous communities and Indigenous leaders. What can we learn from the past and present and carry that into the future? Well, one of the lessons is entrepreneurship. Wherever I go in Canada, I'm always inspired to bump into or get introduced to Indigenous entrepreneurs who are usually doing incredible things that don't maybe make the headline of news or get onto the front page of newspapers. Maybe they should, but that we can learn from. I was in Fort McMurray a couple of years ago and got to spend time with the Fort McKay band and really come to understand what they were building in terms of their community businesses and how they were working with very big companies like Suncor to really succeed as a business, but also to invest some of that success in the community and into new generations. So how do we apply those lessons to agriculture? Agriculture, we often think of almost as a standalone business, farmers working on their own. Agriculture is an integrated supply chain. Of course, the farmer is part of it, but the farmer relies on suppliers of nutrients and seeds, and the farmer relies on people buying their products and developing them and packaging them and selling them to us lucky consumers wherever we may be. So, how do we look at agriculture as a supply chain and see Indigenous entrepreneurs and innovators at each stage of the supply chain, from seed literally to fork? There's all sorts of opportunities there, but to come at it from an entrepreneurial perspective. And one of the ways that I've learned, particularly from the resources sector and the oil sector particularly, is the power of procurement. So how do we ensure that the big companies out there, be they grocery chains or restaurant chains or food packagers, ensure that they are connected with these indigenous entrepreneurs who are creating incredible and sustainable lines of food and food products that we want to get to consumers. So connecting those supply chains is really powerful, but something we can learn from other sectors that have not done it perfectly, but certainly made advancements over the years that we should learn from. Skills, skills, skills. One of the things that we see continuously in our research at RBC is that technology doesn't eliminate jobs in aggregate. Of course, it disrupts and eliminates some jobs specifically, but over the centuries, technology has always led to more jobs, not less. And that's because it creates new jobs, different jobs. And we're all qualified for those jobs if we have underlying foundational skills. What are foundational skills? Those are the skills that I like to refer to as human skills. Critical thinking, collaboration, communications, creativity, which I keep coming back to. Those are the power skills of the 2020s and 2030s, and you see them in every Indigenous community that you can spend time in across the country. In fact, collaboration is just a natural approach to problem solving in Indigenous communities that we in the business community can learn a lot more from. So how do we continue to invest in those foundational skills and not treat them as kind of nice to haves, but must haves, as the power skills that we should all be hiring for, that educators should be developing in the classroom or in the virtual classroom, and that we should be advancing in all of our communities as well as across the economy. And then you can apply those two technologies. So you can't just have those human skills on their own. You need it doesn't mean you need to be a techie, but you need to have a certain aptitude to work with techies to get things done. I saw this in spades in my time in Fort McMurray, where you've seen those monster trucks out in the open mines in the oil sands, the size of small buildings. Those used to be driven by people. And often, and they were really good jobs. They paid $150,000, $200,000 a year. And a lot of them went to Indigenous youth or Indigenous drivers. And that was a really good outcome for a number of years. But increasingly, these monster trucks, just like tractors on farms, are autonomous. And we're going to see more autonomous vehicles, not less, in the years ahead. So I was able to see these trucks drive themselves around the open pit mine, but they actually don't drive themselves. There's someone sitting in a building with a computer like the one I'm looking at with a joystick. It's like a video game controlling the truck and looking at data from the truck to optimize how the mine is working. And the person I got to spend time with was actually a young woman from a local First Nation. And she had those foundational skills in spades of communication and critical thinking, but had been able to develop some tech aptitudes through courses at a local community college that qualified her for one of these mining jobs that was a very different mining job. In fact, no one could have thought of this 10 years ago. They would have thought you were crazy if you said that a job of the future was going to be sitting in a room with a joystick controlling a monster truck. Well, that's a really good job today, and you need different skills for it. But it's actually really liberating for a new generation coming out of communities like the one I was in. So how do we invest in skills so that thousands more Indigenous youth, like the young woman I referenced, are there, willing and able to take advantage of those jobs of the future? And last point, are able to create the jobs of the future, that they're not just sitting waiting for a big company to come along with those jobs, but are actually creating those opportunities and owning those opportunities for years to come. We have to move beyond linear thinking and linear feedback loops. And this is truly the strength of every Indigenous community. And we need to learn from that more broadly in our society, in our boardrooms, in our executive decision making, in our community decision making, maybe even in our politics, which could certainly become more collaborative and constructive than many of us see it to be. So, how do we learn from these Indigenous approaches, which are not some sort of throwback to another era? They're very live and relevant and active today in all sorts of modern and postmodern situations. When I've spent time with some of the most successful First Nation communities, whether it's Membertou in Nova Scotia or Osoyoos and Ahousaht in British Columbia, I'm always really impressed by their decision making, which can sometimes be very corporate, but is also very collaborative. And that's how we're going to solve problems creatively, constructively, and progressively in a non-linear fashion. It's in a circular fashion, but it's not kind of going around and around in circles. It's coming to decisions and implementing those decisions, but not seeing things in a linear or even binary way. I think that is essential to a more sustainable future, but it's also essential to a post-COVID future, because we've only been able to work effectively in this kind of virtual format by taking that more circular approach to conversations and to decision making and to getting going with things. There's such a tremendous hunger for this across the country, especially among a newer generation. So it's time to let them kind of take charge of that circle and get us all going together. This is such an important question and such an important opportunity for Canada. We talk a lot about ESG, environment, social, and governance. And the E side of ESG has become a little overweighted, maybe necessarily so given the climate crisis, but it's become overweighted in recent years. And at times, and I think it's unintentional, but at times it has diminished the S part of it. We've forgotten about investing in the social aspects of all that we're doing. And when we talk about Indigenous opportunities, that is E, S, and G. I don't see it as simply belonging to one. In fact, it's some people say we need the I in ESG, and that's an interesting idea. Do we need ESGI for Indigenous? Whether that's right or wrong, we need I being central to the E, S, and G, but it's particularly central to the S aspect of sustainability, which is all that ESG is about. It's about creating more sustainable business models, sustainable for the planet, sustainable for society, and sustainable for organizations. Because if you don't have good governance, whether it's a community or a business, you're going to implode at some time. That's why you want a strong G. So that's why investors, whether it's all of us buying an ETF or a mutual fund or big pension funds from around the world, are looking at ESG. And as Canadian companies and as Indigenous organizations and Indigenous companies look to attract more investment capital, how do they, and we're in this together, so it's really a we, how do we develop the ESG framework that says to the world of money, we have focus on E, and we know you're asking questions about that, but spend some time understanding about the S part of what we do, because that is really critical. You're not going to get the E if you don't have the S going. And how do we do the G, which is sort of be harping on all these letters and acronyms, but the G part is not just about a big corporate board and legal structure. It's about how we as big companies and small companies work with communities, including Indigenous communities. That's a really important part of the G. It's not just S. Canada, even though we criticize ourselves, and that's one of the best parts of our country, is that we're willing to criticize ourselves and accept criticism. And we're not perfect, and we may not be best in the world, although I'd like to make the argument that we are. We are really good compared to most at the whole ESG construct. And Indigenous businesses in this country are terrific, more often than not, at it. So how do we say to the world of money, these organizations, these Indigenous entrepreneurs who are going to be developing resource projects, who are going to be developing real estate projects in big cities, who are going to be developing infrastructure and owning the infrastructure, whether it's highways or pipelines or carbon pipelines in the years ahead. How do we help that world of money understand that if you're looking for ES&G, you don't need to look a lot farther than what's going on in so many parts of the country. It's such a great question. Allies need to first understand that they are allies. And allies isn't about friendship, although friendship can be part of it. It's a responsibility. It's not a nice to do. Show up when you're needed. It's a responsibility. It's understanding that it's part of your day job to be fulfilling commitments that you've either explicitly or implicitly made to your partners. So all of us who like to see ourselves as allies need to remind ourselves on a daily basis, but be reminded of what we need to do as allies. So if we are talking to investors, to the point of the last question about investment opportunities, ensure that we're using that privileged podium that we might have, or the privileged table that we're at, to say, we hope you are looking at investment opportunities with Indigenous entrepreneurs, and we'd like to help you do that. We need to listen. That's a really important part of being an ally, is to listen to what your partners are saying and learning and needing, and then making those connections. And then lastly, ensuring that we are embedding these conversations in every conversation that we're having. This is really at the heart of reconciliation. Reconciliation is not a to-do list that sits separately to a to-do list that we've all got separately. It is part of every to-do list that we should have as individuals, as communities, and as companies. So as we're thinking about whatever big and small decisions that we're making, ensuring that we're centralizing, and this is what allies should be doing, Indigenous concerns, but Indigenous opportunities, because there's far more opportunities than we recognize in all of our conversations. I'm so grateful to be a part of a conversation about sustainability, about Canada's Indigenous future, and about agriculture, because it's really the same conversation. And as we come out of this really exhilarating series of virtual discussions, I'm sorry it's not together in person, how do we think of agriculture 4.0, about farmer 4.0, about food producers and Indigenous food producers, whether they are fishers or farmers or food processors in every part of the country? How do we think really creatively and constructively about taking Indigenous knowledge and these remarkable advanced technologies, from drones to robots to algorithms, that are transforming agriculture, and putting them together in a way that maybe no other country in the world can do, to create that truly sustainable approach to agriculture that we need, not just for reconciliation, that we need not just for the prosperity of those involved, but frankly, that we need for the sustainability of the planet. One of our great challenges on this planet for the next quarter century is going to be finding new ways to feed ourselves, to feed 9 billion people. And we're going to have to do it differently than the way we've done for generations. And that creativity is going to have to come from Canadians. It really should come from Indigenous Canadians at the forefront. And so the more tables like this that we can build to talk about innovation, about agriculture innovation, and about ways to connect traditional knowledge with a new generation and new technologies, the more we can be at the forefront of a really positive global agriculture revolution.